March 17, 1945, Camp Florence, Arizona. Lieutenant Thomas Whitmore stood outside Compound C, watching as a transport truck carrying 32 Japanese women rumbled through the checkpoint. His clipboard trembled slightly in the desert wind, not from nerves, but from the weight of what he'd been ordered to prepare. The women descending from the truck wore tattered clothing, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow from months of uncertainty. They had been captured in the Philippines after the fall of Manila, initially held in overcrowded facilities near the combat zones, then transferred across the Pacific to this sprawling detention center in the American Southwest. What awaited them inside would challenge everything the United States Army had been told about managing enemy prisoners, and what these women expected about their captors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant Whitmore had received his assignment to Camp Florence just 6 weeks earlier, in late January, 1945. A career officer who had spent most of the war managing logistics at stateside bases, he'd never expected to find himself responsible for the welfare of enemy civilians. His orders had been explicit but puzzling. The War Department, through a memorandum dated January 9, 1945, had instructed all POW camp commanders to implement what they called enhanced humanitarian protocols for female detainees of Japanese origin. The directive came from Colonel Gerald Hutchinson, head of the Prisoner of War Division, under the Provost Marshal General's office, a man known for his by-the-book approach to military regulations and international law. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States had signed and ratified, outlined specific protections for prisoners of war. But these women occupied a gray area in military classification. They were not soldiers. Most were civilians who had been living in occupied territories, working as teachers, nurses, administrative staff for Japanese companies, or simply residing with family members. When American forces recaptured Manila in February 1945, thousands of Japanese nationals found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of the front lines. The military designated them as civilian internees, rather than prisoners of war, which technically placed them outside the strictest Geneva Convention protections, yet the Army had chosen to apply even higher standards of care. Colonel Hutchinson's directive specified requirements that seemed extravagant, given wartime resource constraints. Each female internee was to receive private sleeping quarters or shared accommodations with no more than 4 persons per room. Daily bathing facilities with heated water were to be made available. Medical care equivalent to that provided to American military personnel was mandated. Food rations were to meet or exceed the caloric and nutritional standards of Army field rations. Educational and recreational opportunities were to be provided. The list went on for 3 single-spaced pages. Lieutenant Whitmore had read the directive multiple times, searching for the rationale behind such generous treatment of enemy nationals. The document offered only one brief explanation in its opening paragraph. The United States of America wages war against tyranny and oppression, not against innocent civilians caught in circumstances beyond their control. Our treatment of those in our custody will reflect American values and will stand as testimony to the principles for which we fight. This policy serves both humanitarian imperatives and strategic interests in demonstrating the superiority of democratic governance. The strategic interests part made sense to Whitmore from a propaganda perspective. Photographs and testimonies of well-treated Japanese internees could be powerful psychological warfare tools in undermining enemy morale and encouraging surrender. But the scale of investment seemed disproportionate to that goal. Camp Florence was spending more per capita on its Japanese female internees than many Army bases spent on their own personnel. The facilities prepared for the incoming women represented months of construction work and significant expense. Compound C had been completely renovated between December 1944 and February 1945. The barracks, originally designed to house German and Italian POWs in large open dormitories, had been subdivided into smaller rooms. Each room contained 4 beds with actual mattresses, not the standard military cots. Wooden floors had been installed over the concrete, windows had been fitted with curtains. The communal bathroom facility had been expanded and completely rebuilt. It was the bathroom facility that represented the most dramatic departure from standard POW camp construction. Master Sergeant Robert Chen, the camp's chief engineer, had overseen the project personally. Chen, a first-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, had worked in commercial construction before the war and brought professional expertise to military engineering challenges. He had initially questioned the elaborate specifications for the women's bathing facilities. The plans called for a building containing 16 individual shower stalls, each enclosed with floor-to-ceiling walls and locking doors, 8 porcelain sinks with mirrors, 6 flush toilets in fully enclosed stalls, and most remarkably, a water heating system capable of providing hot water for extended periods. The heating system alone cost more than the entire original construction budget for the compound's barracks. Sergeant Chen had presented his concerns to Lieutenant Whitmore in early February. "Sir, I understand we're required to provide adequate facilities, but these specifications exceed anything I've seen in military construction. Individual shower stalls with hot water, that's luxury hotel standard. Most army bases don't provide that for their own troops. We're talking about thousands of dollars in materials and equipment that are in short supply for critical war production." Whitmore had shared Chen's skepticism but had his orders. The War Department had designated Camp Florence as a model facility specifically because it was far from combat zones and had available construction capacity. 2 other camps, one in Montana and one in New Mexico, were receiving similar directives and resources. The 3 facilities would house approximately 200 Japanese women total, a small fraction of the tens of thousands of Japanese Americans already interned in relocation centers, and an even smaller fraction of the hundreds of thousands of German and Italian POWs held in camps across America. The different treatment bothered Whitmore. German POWs at Camp Florence lived in standard barracks with communal showers that provided only cold water except for 1 day per week. They slept on military cots, their food was adequate but plain. They had recreation time but limited educational opportunities. Why were these Japanese women, citizens of a nation still actively at war with America, receiving treatment superior to that given to German prisoners, and in many cases superior to what American soldiers received at forward bases? Captain Sarah Mitchell, the camp's medical officer, had offered an explanation when Whitmore raised the question during a staff meeting in mid-February. She was one of only 3 female officers at Camp Florence, a physician who had served in military hospitals in England before being reassigned to POW camp duty. Her perspective carried weight among the predominantly male officer corps. "Lieutenant, I believe the War Department is operating from lessons learned in the Pacific Theater. The intelligence reports I've seen suggest that Japanese military and civilian populations have been indoctrinated to believe Americans are barbaric monsters who torture and murder prisoners. That propaganda has been remarkably effective. Japanese soldiers fight to the death rather than surrender because they genuinely believe capture means torture. Civilians in recaptured territories have committed suicide rather than fall into American hands. The directive to provide exceptional treatment to these women is psychological warfare aimed at undermining that propaganda. If these women receive humane, even generous treatment, and if word of that treatment reaches Japan through neutral channels or after the war, it could save American lives by encouraging surrender and reducing fanatical resistance." The strategic logic made sense, but Whitmore remained troubled by the implications. War had always involved clear categories of friend and enemy, combatant and civilian, victor and vanquished. These women occupied an ambiguous space that challenged those neat distinctions. They were enemy nationals, yet they were also victims of war's displacement. They represented a hostile power, yet they possessed no military capability. They should be guarded and contained, yet they were to be treated with unprecedented consideration. The day before the women's arrival, Whitmore had inspected Compound C one final time with Sergeant Chen and Captain Mitchell. The transformation was remarkable. The barracks that had housed German POWs in Spartan conditions now resembled a modest residential facility. The rooms were clean and bright. Each bed had sheets, blankets and a pillow. Small wooden desks and chairs occupied corners. The communal areas included a recreation room with tables, chairs and bookshelves waiting to be filled. A separate classroom space stood ready for educational programs. But it was the bathing facility that drew the longest inspection. Sergeant Chen walked them through the building with obvious pride in his work despite his earlier objections. The facility had been constructed as a separate small building connected to the main barracks by a covered walkway. Upon entering, visitors found themselves in a changing area with benches and lockers. Beyond that, the 16 shower stalls lined 2 walls, each one a private enclosed space approximately 4 feet square. The doors were solid wood with simple hook latches, providing complete privacy. Inside each stall, a shower head extended from the wall with clearly marked hot and cold controls. The porcelain fixtures gleamed. The tile floors had been carefully grouted and sealed. The hot water system occupied a utility room at the building's rear. Two large water heaters, each capable of holding 80 gallons, had been installed in parallel. A coal-fired boiler maintained water temperature. Sergeant Chen explained the system's capacity. With proper management, we can provide hot showers for all 32 women over a 3-hour period each evening. The water temperature can be individually controlled in each stall. The system is designed for reliability rather than just meeting minimum requirements. Captain Mitchell had examined the medical provisions with equal thoroughness. A small infirmary had been established in a corner of the main barracks, equipped with examination table, medicine cabinet, and supplies sufficient to treat common ailments. More serious cases would be transferred to the camp's main hospital, where they would receive the same care as American personnel. Mitchell had insisted on this provision over objections from other officers who felt it created security risks. The food service arrangements reflected similar attention to detail. Rather than eating in the main camp mess hall with other prisoners, the women would receive meals in a dining area. Within Compound C, the menu had been designed by the camp's head. Working with a nutritionist from the War Department, it incorporated both American staples and attempts at Japanese dishes, using ingredients available through military supply channels. Rice would be served at every meal. Tea would be provided.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The caloric content exceeded standard POW rations. Lieutenant Whitmore stood in the empty dining area the evening before the women's arrival, trying to imagine their reaction. Would they be suspicious? Grateful? Confused? His training had prepared him to manage prisoners who might be hostile, defiant, or depressed. It had not prepared him for prisoners who might be shocked by kindness. The women arrived on that windy March afternoon in a convoy of 3 trucks escorted by military police. They had traveled from San Francisco, where they had been processed through a temporary holding facility after their trans-Pacific voyage. The journey had taken 8 days due to military transport priorities and the circuitous routing required to avoid overtaxed rail lines. They were exhausted, frightened, and completely uncertain about what awaited them. Lieutenant Whitmore watched as they climbed down from the trucks, assisted by MP guards who maintained professional distance. The women ranged in age from late teens to 60s. Most wore salvaged civilian clothing that had seen hard use. A few still wore the tattered remnants of the dresses they had been wearing when captured. Their faces showed the strain of their journey and the trauma of displacement. Several of the older women helped the younger ones, maintaining a quiet dignity despite their obvious fear. Captain Mitchell approached the group first, speaking in carefully practiced Japanese phrases she had been studying for weeks. Her pronunciation was rough, but sincere. "Welcome to Camp Florence. You are safe here. We will provide for your needs. Please follow me and I will show you to your accommodations." The women responded with silent bows, their eyes downcast. None spoke. They formed a loose group and followed Captain Mitchell toward the compound entrance, their movements cautious and uncertain. Whitmore walked alongside the column, maintaining what he hoped was a reassuring but not threatening presence. The MP guards remained at a distance. The reaction when they entered the barracks exceeded anything Whitmore had anticipated. The first women through the door stopped so abruptly that those behind nearly collided with them. They stared at the clean, bright space with expressions of complete disbelief. One elderly woman raised a trembling hand to her mouth. A younger woman began to cry silently, tears streaming down her face as she looked around the room. Captain Mitchell guided them through the facility room by room. The women touched the beds hesitantly, as if expecting them to disappear. They examined the desks and chairs with wonder. When Mitchell opened the curtains to show the windows could be covered for privacy, several women gasped audibly. The concept that they would have any privacy at all seemed to shock them more than the physical amenities. But nothing prepared them, or Whitmore, for the reaction to the bathing facility. Captain Mitchell had saved that for last, perhaps instinctively understanding it would be the most powerful moment. She led the group to the separate building and opened the door to the changing area. The women filed in silently, their eyes taking in the benches, the lockers, the clean tile floors. Then Mitchell walked them into the main shower area. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Multiple women began crying openly. Others sank to their knees on the floor. The elderly woman who had covered her mouth earlier now covered her face with both hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. A middle-aged woman in a torn gray dress walked slowly to one of the shower stalls, opened the door, and stepped inside fully clothed. She stood there for a long moment, then reached out and turned the hot water handle. Water poured from the shower head, and within 30 seconds, steam began rising. The woman held her hand under the stream, feeling the heat. Then she turned to face Captain Mitchell and Lieutenant Whitmore, and spoke in clear but accented English. "Hot water. You give us hot water. We are prisoners. We are enemy. But you give us hot water." Captain Mitchell nodded, her own eyes glistening. "Yes, hot water. You can shower every day if you wish. The water is for you." The woman in the shower stall slowly sank to her knees on the tile floor, heedless of the water soaking her clothes. She pressed her forehead to the ground in a deep bow and began speaking rapidly in Japanese. Other women joined her, some kneeling, some bowing, all speaking in their native language. The words were unintelligible to Whitmore, but their emotional content was unmistakable. Later that evening, after the women had been given time to settle in their rooms and had been served dinner, Whitmore met with his senior staff to debrief. Captain Mitchell was visibly shaken by the afternoon's events. Sergeant Chen sat quietly, his earlier skepticism about the project's expense clearly reconsidered. The camp chaplain, Father Michael O'Connor, had been present during the orientation and had his own observations to share. Father O'Connor, an Irish-American priest from Boston, who had volunteered for military service despite being over 40, spoke first. "Gentlemen and Captain Mitchell, I have served in this camp for 18 months. I have seen German officers who were treated with respect show nothing but arrogance. I have seen Italian prisoners given comfortable quarters respond with demands for even better conditions. But today, I witnessed something entirely different. Those women were not merely grateful, they were stunned. Their reaction suggests they expected something very different from American captivity." Captain Mitchell pulled out a small notebook where she had been recording observations. "I was able to speak with one of the women who speaks English, a former teacher named Kimiko Yamada. She's 42 years old, was teaching at a Japanese school in Manila when the Americans arrived. According to Miss Yamada, the Japanese military and government authorities had told all civilians that capture by Americans would mean torture, starvation, and likely execution. Women specifically were told they would be subjected to assault and degradation. When they saw the clean barracks and especially the private bathing facilities with hot water, it contradicted everything they had been conditioned to believe." Sergeant Chen interjected. "The hot water was that significant?" Captain Mitchell nodded emphatically. "In traditional Japanese culture, bathing is not merely about hygiene. It represents purification, dignity and self-respect. The ability to bathe properly, especially in hot water, carries profound cultural meaning. By providing private facilities with hot water, we're not just meeting a physical need, we're acknowledging their humanity and dignity in a way that resonates deeply with their cultural values." Lieutenant Whitmore absorbed this information, realizing the War Department's directives had been more culturally informed than he had understood. Someone in Washington had recognized that the path to undermining Japanese propaganda required more than just adequate treatment. It required gestures that would be culturally significant to the recipients. The following morning brought new challenges. The women needed to be organized into some form of routine. Work assignments needed to be made, though the War Department's directives specifically limited the types of labor that could be required. Educational programs needed to be established. Medical examinations needed to be conducted, and Whitmore needed to establish authority without creating an atmosphere of oppression. He called a meeting in the compound's recreation room, with Captain Mitchell serving as translator. The 32 women gathered quietly, sitting on chairs or on the floor. They maintained the same cautious demeanor as the previous day, uncertain about what would be required of them. Whitmore stood at the front of the room, acutely aware that every word and gesture would be scrutinized and interpreted. He began with the basics. "You are civilian internees, under the protection of the United States Army. You will remain here for the duration of hostilities between our nations. During your time at Camp Florence, you will be provided with housing, food, medical care, and the opportunity for education and recreation. In return, you will be expected to maintain your living areas, assist with food preparation and service, and participate in camp activities as directed. You will not be required to perform labor that supports the American war effort. Your treatment will comply with international law and American values." Captain Mitchell translated carefully, and Whitmore watched the women's faces as they absorbed the information. Most remained impassive, but a few showed signs of confusion. One younger woman, perhaps in her early 20s, raised her hand tentatively. Whitmore nodded to her. She spoke in halting English. "Sir, we do not understand why you treat us this way. We are Japanese, you are American, we are at war, why you give us good things?" It was the question Whitmore had been asking himself. He chose his words carefully. The United States fights against military aggression and tyranny. We do not fight against innocent people. You did not choose this war. You did not take up arms against us. You are civilians who found yourselves in a war zone. Our treatment of you reflects what America stands for. We believe all people deserve basic dignity and humane treatment, regardless of which nation they come from. The young woman persisted. But Japanese soldiers, they tell us Americans are cruel. They say you hurt prisoners. They say you have no honor. This what you do here. This is not what they told us. Whitmore saw the opening and took it. What you were told was false. This is the truth. This is how America treats those in our custody. You can see for yourself now. You don't have to believe what you were told anymore. You can trust what you experience here. The conversation continued for another hour, with questions ranging from practical matters about daily routines to deeper concerns about their families and futures. Whitmore answered honestly when he could and admitted uncertainty when he couldn't. The war's outcome remained undecided. Their eventual fate would depend on factors beyond his control. But while they remained at Camp Florence, they would be treated fairly. Over the following weeks, a routine established itself in Compound C. The women adapted to their new circumstances with a mixture of gratitude and lingering disbelief. The morning routine began at 7 with breakfast in the dining area. Meals had evolved as the camp cooks learned from the women's feedback. Rice remained the staple, but American vegetables were incorporated in ways that approximated Japanese preparation methods. The women particularly appreciated the tea service, which had been enhanced after Captain Mitchell requisitioned proper tea supplies through military channels. After breakfast, the women divided into work groups. Some maintained the barracks, cleaning and organizing the communal spaces. Others assisted in the kitchen, helping prepare meals for the compound. A third group worked in a small garden area that Sergeant Chen had established, growing vegetables that supplemented their rations. The work was light by POW camp standards, more about maintaining order and purpose than extracting labor. Afternoons were reserved for education and recreation. Captain Mitchell had organized English language classes for those interested in improving their skills. Several women who already spoke English well served as teachers for others. The classes became popular not just for language learning but as social gathering times where women could interact and support each other. A small library had been established with books donated by various sources, including surprisingly local church groups who had heard about the camp's mission. But the evening ritual became the most significant part of each day. At 6 o'clock after dinner, the bathing facility opened. The women had developed their own system for scheduling shower times, ensuring everyone had access without crowding. They typically allowed 30 minutes per person, which seemed extravagant by military standards but reflected the cultural importance they placed on bathing. Lieutenant Whitmore made a point of checking the facility's boiler system each evening to ensure the hot water supply remained adequate. Sergeant Chen had trained 2 of the older women to monitor the system and report any problems, giving them a sense of responsibility and control over something important to the group. The boiler never failed in those first months, but its reliable operation became a symbol of the camp's commitment to their welfare. One evening in mid-April, about a month after the women's arrival, Whitmore was conducting his routine inspection when he encountered Miss Yamada, the former teacher who spoke the best English among the group. She was waiting near the facility entrance, apparently hoping to speak with him. Whitmore had learned to recognize when the women wanted to communicate something significant but were hesitant to approach directly. Miss Yamada, good evening. Is everything satisfactory with the facilities? She bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that the women maintained despite assurances it wasn't required. Lieutenant Whitmore, I wish to speak with you about something important. May I have a moment of your time? Whitmore gestured to a nearby bench. Of course, please, sit if you'd like. She remained standing, clearly more comfortable with formality. I have been asked by the other women to express our gratitude. We have been here 1 month now. Every day we wake up and wonder if this treatment will end. Every day we expect to be told the hot water was a mistake, or the good food was temporary, or the private rooms will be taken away. But every day these things continue. We do not understand why, but we are grateful. Whitmore felt the weight of her words. The sustained nature of decent treatment had proven more powerful than the initial shock. The women had been conditioned to expect betrayal and cruelty, so the continued absence of those things carried. You don't need to thank me, Miss Yamada. This is simply how we do things. This is the American way. She shook her head gently. Lieutenant, this is not normal. We have spoken among ourselves. Some women here were in other camps before coming to Florence. They tell stories of cold water only, of sleeping on the ground, of guards who were cruel. Some were in Japanese camps before the Americans captured Manila. They tell stories of much worse treatment. What you do here is special, not normal. We want you to know we understand this. The conversation continued as Miss Yamada explained what she had learned from the other women. Several had indeed been held in Japanese-run civilian internment camps in the Philippines where conditions had been harsh. Others had been in temporary American detention facilities immediately after Manila's recapture, where they had been treated correctly but with minimal resources. The contrast with Camp Florence had led them to conclude that their current treatment represented either an elaborate deception preparing them for something worse or a genuine commitment to humane treatment that exceeded standard practice. Whitmore chose honesty. Miss Yamada, I want to be clear with you. Camp Florence was chosen specifically to demonstrate how America treats civilian internees. The facilities you have here are better than what many other camps provide because our government wanted to show that we take the Geneva Convention seriously, even when it doesn't technically apply to civilian internees. This treatment isn't a trick, it's deliberate policy, but I also want to be honest that not every camp has these resources. You are fortunate to be here rather than in a facility that had less funding or preparation time. Miss Yamada absorbed this information thoughtfully. Then you are using us to show something to others, like propaganda. Whitmore considered his words carefully. Yes, in a sense. If word gets back to Japan that Japanese civilians in American custody are treated well, it might encourage others to surrender rather than fight to the death. It might save lives on both sides. So there is a strategic purpose to treating you well, but that doesn't make the treatment any less real, or the commitment any less genuine. The hot water isn't propaganda, it's actual hot water that you actually get to use. She smiled slightly, perhaps the first smile Whitmore had seen from any of the women. Yes, the hot water is very real, and very appreciated. I will tell the others what you have said. They will understand that there is strategy behind your kindness, but I think they will also appreciate your honesty. It is better to know the truth than to wonder forever. The conversation marked a turning point in the compound's atmosphere. The women began to relax incrementally, accepting that their treatment was stable even if its underlying motivations were complex. They participated more actively in camp activities. They offered suggestions for improvements to daily routines. They began to treat their quarters not just as prison cells but as temporary homes. Captain Mitchell documented these changes in regular reports to the War Department. Her medical observations noted improvements in the women's physical and mental health. Weight gain averaged 8 pounds per person over the first 2 months, indicating both better nutrition and reduced stress. Incidents of depression and anxiety decreased. Sleep patterns normalized. The women began taking pride in their appearance again, using the bathing facilities not just for cleaning but for the psychological restoration that regular bathing provided. The success of Camp Florence's program drew attention from military authorities and civilian observers. In May 1945, a delegation from the War Department arrived to inspect the facility and interview both staff and internees. The delegation included Colonel Hutchinson, whose original directive had established the program, along with several other officers and a civilian consultant on international law. Colonel Hutchinson was a lean man in his mid-50s with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing during his inspection. He walked through Compound C with Lieutenant Whitmore, asking detailed questions about operations, costs, and outcomes. He observed the women during their daily activities, noting their demeanor and apparent health. He spent considerable time examining the bathing facilities, even watching the boiler system in operation. After 2 days of inspection, Colonel Hutchinson assembled Whitmore's staff for a debriefing. His assessment was blunt and revealing. Lieutenant Whitmore, Captain Mitchell, Sergeant Chen, and the rest of your staff, I want to commend you on what you've accomplished here. This facility has exceeded our expectations in demonstrating that humane treatment of enemy civilians is both practically feasible and strategically valuable. Your attention to cultural factors, particularly regarding the bathing facilities, has proven especially effective. However, I need you to understand the broader context of what we're doing here and why it matters. He pulled out a folder containing documents marked classified. These reports come from intelligence sources in the Pacific. They document Japanese military and civilian behavior when facing capture. The statistics are sobering. Japanese soldiers surrender at a rate of approximately 0.5%, compared to German or Italian forces. Civilians in recaptured territories commit suicide at alarming rates rather than face what they've been told to expect from American forces. This behavior is based on propaganda that depicts Americans as inhuman monsters, Colonel Hutchinson continued. The cost of this propaganda to American forces is measured in lives. Every Japanese soldier who fights to the death instead of surrendering creates casualties. Every civilian who commits suicide represents a failure of psychological warfare. Every bunker that has to be cleared with flamethrowers and explosives costs America. If we can undermine the propaganda that creates this behavior, we save American lives. That is the strategic purpose of facilities like Camp Florence. He gestured around the room. This compound, these women, the hot showers they receive every evening, all of this represents psychological warfare of the most effective kind. We are demonstrating through verifiable evidence that Japanese propaganda about American barbarity is false. Some of these women will survive the war, they will return to Japan eventually, they will tell their families and neighbors what they experienced here. That testimony will be more powerful than any leaflet we could drop from airplanes. The colonel's next statement sent a chill through the room. But understand this, what you're doing here works precisely because it's genuine. If this were merely a propaganda exercise, if these women were being treated well only for show while others suffered, the truth would eventually emerge and the damage to American credibility would be severe. The reason this program succeeds is because it reflects actual American values about human dignity and the rules of war. You must continue to treat these women as you have been, not as prisoners to be exploited, but as human beings deserving of respect. Lieutenant Whitmore absorbed the colonel's words, understanding for the first time the full weight of his responsibility. He wasn't just managing a detention facility, he was demonstrating American values to an enemy population that had been taught to see Americans as evil. The hot showers weren't just amenities, they were arguments against hatred, delivered in the most powerful possible form through direct experience. The delegation's visit concluded with recommendations to expand the program to additional facilities and to document outcomes more systematically. Colonel Hutchinson specifically requested that Captain Mitchell prepare a detailed report on the cultural factors that made certain amenities particularly significant to Japanese internees. That report would be used to train staff at other camps and to inform policy decisions about civilian internee treatment. As spring turned to summer in 1945, the war in the Pacific intensified. American forces captured Okinawa after brutal fighting. Preparations began for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. The women in Compound C followed news reports with obvious anxiety about their homeland and families. Yet their daily routine continued unchanged. The hot water flowed, the meals arrived, the educational programs proceeded. The small garden flourished under their care. In early August, news reached Camp Florence of atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The women gathered in their recreation room, listening to radio broadcasts in stunned silence. The magnitude of destruction was incomprehensible. Many had family in the affected regions. The grief and horror were palpable throughout the compound. Lieutenant Whitmore faced a difficult decision about how to address the situation. He consulted with Captain Mitchell and Father O'Connor, then decided on direct engagement rather than avoiding the topic. He called a compound meeting and spoke to the assembled women with Miss Yamada. You have heard the news about the weapons used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction is terrible. Many of you have family who may have been affected. I cannot tell you your families are safe, because I do not know. What I can tell you is that the United States did not make this decision lightly. The goal is to end the war and stop the killing on all sides. That doesn't make the suffering any less real, or the loss any less painful. We will provide any support we can during this difficult time. The women's reaction was complex. Some were angry, others were grief-stricken, and a few seemed almost relieved that perhaps the war might finally end. Miss Yamada spoke for the group. Lieutenant Whitmore, we do not understand why such terrible weapons were used, but we also know that war is terrible in many ways. Japanese soldiers have killed many people. American bombs have killed many people. Everyone has lost family. Everyone has suffered. We do not know if what America did was right or wrong. We only know we want the war to end so no more people die. Days later, Japan announced its surrender. The war was over. The women of Compound C faced an uncertain future. Would they be sent home immediately? Would they be held for additional time? What would they find when they returned to Japan? Their relief at the war's end mixed with anxiety about what came next. The post-war period brought its own challenges to Camp Florence. With hostilities ended, the urgency of maintaining the facility decreased, but the responsibility for the women's welfare remained. Lieutenant Whitmore received orders that the internees would remain at Camp Florence until transportation could be arranged and until conditions in Japan stabilized sufficiently to allow safe repatriation. That process would take months. During those months, something unexpected happened. The relationship between the women and their captors evolved from wary coexistence to something approaching friendship. With the war over, the barriers of enemy status began to erode. The women began teaching Japanese language and cultural practices to interested staff members. Captain Mitchell organized sessions where the women could share their experiences and tell their stories. Sergeant Chen worked with several women to expand the garden into a more elaborate Japanese-style arrangement. The bathing facility remained central to daily life, but its significance shifted. What had been a shocking luxury that contradicted propaganda now became a space of healing and restoration. The women helped each other process grief over lost family members. They supported each other through the uncertainty of waiting for repatriation. The hot water that had initially stunned them with its unexpected presence now provided comfort as they prepared to rebuild their lives. In November 1945, 8 months after their arrival, the women of Compound C began the process of repatriation. They would travel in groups over several weeks as space became available on ships returning to Japan. The farewell ceremonies were emotional for everyone involved. Women who had arrived as frightened prisoners departed as individuals whose dignity had been recognized and respected throughout their captivity. Miss Yamada was in the final group to depart, scheduled to leave in early December. The day before her departure, she requested a final meeting with Lieutenant Whitmore. They sat in the recreation room that had been the site of their first tentative conversations months earlier. She had prepared a statement that she wanted to deliver formally. Lieutenant Whitmore, I have been asked by all the women who were here to express our deepest gratitude for how we were treated. When we arrived, we expected cruelty because that is what we had been taught to expect. Instead, we found kindness. We expected degradation. Instead, we found dignity. The hot showers that shocked us on our first day became a symbol of something larger. They showed us that what we had been told about Americans was false. They showed us that even in war there can be humanity. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I am a teacher. Before the war, I taught young students about duty and honor and loyalty to Japan. I taught them what the government wanted me to teach. When I return to Japan, I will teach again if I am able, but I will teach differently. I will teach my students that all people deserve respect, regardless of which nation they belong to. I will teach them that America, which we fought against, treated us with more dignity when we were prisoners than our own military treated people in camps they controlled. This is a hard truth, but it is the truth I learned here. Whitmore felt the weight of her words. The strategic purpose of Camp Florence had been to demonstrate American values and undermine enemy propaganda, but the human impact had been far more profound than any strategic calculation. These women had experienced a challenge to everything they had been taught, not through arguments or propaganda, but through months of consistent decent treatment. Miss Yamada concluded her statement. The hot water you provided was not just water. It was proof that kindness is possible even between enemies. It was proof that dignity can be maintained even in captivity. It was proof that what makes a nation good is not its military power but how it treats those who cannot resist. Please tell your government that their policy here achieved more than they may realize. They did not just treat prisoners well. The repatriation process concluded by February 1946. All 32 women returned to a devastated Japan facing reconstruction and uncertainty. Yet they carried with them experiences that contradicted years of indoctrination. Miss Yamada resumed teaching in Osaka, speaking cautiously but honestly about her time in American custody. Other women shared similar stories with family and neighbors. The testimonies spread quietly through communities still processing defeat. Colonel Hutchinson's final report to the War Department documented outcomes that exceeded expectations. The women's testimonies upon return to Japan had reached American intelligence sources through various channels. Their accounts consistently emphasized the dignity of their treatment, particularly the bathing facilities that had symbolized respect for their humanity. Several women had explicitly stated their experiences changed their understanding of Americans and democracy. The psychological impact extended beyond the individuals directly affected. Intelligence analysts noted shifts in Japanese civilian attitudes in areas where repatriated internees settled. Resistance to American occupation policies decreased measurably in these communities. Cooperation with reconstruction efforts increased. The correlation suggested that personal testimony about humane treatment carried more persuasive power than official propaganda could achieve. Lieutenant Whitmore received orders transferring him to occupation duty in Japan in March 1946. His experience managing Compound C had given him insights valuable for civilian affairs. Before departing Camp Florence, he walked through the now empty facility one final time. The barracks stood silent. The garden showed early spring growth. The bathing facility remained operational though unused. Sergeant Chen had maintained the systems despite the compound's closure, perhaps recognizing their symbolic importance. Standing in the shower building, Whitmore reflected on what had been accomplished. The facility had cost thousands of dollars and countless hours of labor. It had provided hot water to 32 women for less than a year. By conventional military metrics, the investment seemed disproportionate to tactical outcomes. Yet the strategic results suggested otherwise. Those hot showers had challenged enemy propaganda more effectively than leaflets or broadcasts ever could. Captain Mitchell's comprehensive report on cultural factors in internee treatment became required reading at military staff colleges. Her analysis of how specific amenities carried significance beyond their practical function influenced post-war occupation policies throughout Japan. The principle that respecting cultural values could advance strategic objectives became foundational to American approaches in reconstruction efforts. The broader impact revealed itself gradually over subsequent years. As Japan rebuilt under American occupation, attitudes toward the occupying forces remained surprisingly cooperative compared to expectations. Historians analyzing this phenomenon identified multiple factors, but personal testimonies from former internees consistently appeared in the documentary record. The women who had experienced humane treatment spoke to family, friends, and community members about what they had witnessed. One particularly striking example emerged in 1948, when a community in suburban Tokyo invited American military personnel to a cultural exchange event. The invitation came from a women's organization led by a former Compound C internee who had settled in the area. In the area, she had organized the event specifically to introduce her neighbors to Americans in a context that challenged lingering prejudices. The success of that initial event led to similar programs across occupied Japan. By 1950, as the occupation transitioned toward Japanese sovereignty, American authorities conducted surveys assessing civilian attitudes. The results showed remarkable shifts from wartime propaganda positions. Significant majorities now viewed Americans as respectful of Japanese culture and committed to fair treatment. When surveyors asked what had influenced these changed perceptions, personal testimonies from repatriated civilians appeared frequently in responses. The strategic value of Camp Florence's approach became clearer with historical perspective. The facility had operated for less than a year at a cost of approximately $50,000 beyond standard detention expenses. That investment had contributed to changing attitudes among a population of millions, facilitating peaceful occupation and reconstruction. The return on investment, measured in reduced resistance and increased cooperation, far exceeded the initial expenditure. Lieutenant Whitmore, now a major serving in Tokyo, encountered Miss Yamada again in 1949. She had continued teaching and had become involved in educational reform efforts under the occupation government. They met at a conference on democratic education practices where she was presenting on incorporating respect for human dignity into curriculum standards. After her presentation, they spoke privately. Whitmore asked how her experiences at Camp Florence had influenced her work. Her answer revealed the lasting impact of those months. Everything I teach now about democracy and human rights begins with the understanding that all people deserve dignity regardless of circumstances. I learned that lesson in an American prison camp through something as simple as hot water. My students hear that story and understand that principles matter more than propaganda, she continued, explaining how her message had resonated. When I tell young people that Americans treated us as human beings even though we were enemies, even though Japan had committed terrible acts, even though they had every reason to be cruel, it challenges them to think differently about conflict and humanity. Some students initially refused to believe it, but I was there, I experienced it. My testimony is evidence that cannot be dismissed. The educational impact multiplied across Japan as other former internees pursued similar paths. Several became teachers, social workers, or community organizers. They carried forward the lessons learned at Camp Florence in similar facilities, spreading ideas about human dignity and democratic values through personal testimony rather than imposed ideology. The occupation's success in transforming Japanese society owed something to these quiet ambassadors of experience. The bathing facilities that had shocked the women on their arrival had represented more than physical amenities. They had embodied a principle that respect for human dignity transcended national enmity. That principle, demonstrated through consistent action over months, had proven more persuasive than any argument could have been. The women had arrived expecting barbarism because propaganda had taught them to expect nothing else. They departed carrying evidence that challenged everything they had been told. Sergeant Chen, who had initially questioned the elaborate specifications for the shower building, later reflected on the project's significance in an interview for a military engineering journal. "I built that facility thinking it was wasteful excess. I was wrong. The best engineering projects solve problems efficiently. That bathroom solved a problem I hadn't understood existed." It challenged propaganda through plumbing, it changed minds through water temperature. Sometimes the best solutions come from understanding human psychology rather than just meeting technical requirements. By the mid-1950s, as Japanese economic recovery accelerated and the occupation ended, the legacy of programs like Camp Florence became clear. Japan emerged as a stable democracy and American ally in a region where such outcomes had seemed unlikely. Multiple factors contributed to this transformation, but the foundation of trust built through humane treatment of civilians during and after the war provided crucial groundwork. American military analysts studying the Pacific occupation's success identified treatment of internees and prisoners as a significant factor distinguishing outcomes in Japan from less successful occupations elsewhere. The principle that winning peace required more than winning battles, that changing minds required demonstrating values rather than just declaring them, became incorporated into military doctrine for future conflicts. The women of Compound C lived out their lives in post-war Japan, most never returning to America, yet their experiences continued to influence attitudes and policies decades after the war's end. Miss Yamada taught until her retirement in 1978, educating thousands of students about democratic values and human dignity. She frequently told the story of her imprisonment and the hot showers that had challenged her understanding of enemies and humanity. In 1985, at age 82, Miss Yamada participated in a documentary about American occupation policies. She spoke directly to the camera about Camp Florence. "I was a prisoner of war, technically a civilian internee, but a prisoner nonetheless. I expected cruelty because I had been taught that Americans were cruel. Instead, I found humanity. The hot water in those showers represented something larger than physical comfort. It represented the principle that all people deserve basic dignity, even enemies, even prisoners, even in wartime. That principle changed my life and influenced everything I taught afterward." The documentary included footage of Camp Florence, now abandoned and deteriorating. The barracks had been demolished years earlier, but the bathing facility remained partially intact, a concrete monument to a brief moment when hot water had carried strategic significance. The production crew filmed the empty shower stalls, the rusted pipes, the cracked tile floors. The building that had shocked 32 Japanese women with unexpected kindness stood silent, its purpose fulfilled decades earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Whitmore, retired from the Army in 1962, watched the documentary from his home in Virginia. He had continued following the lives of several Compound C women through occasional correspondence over the years. Miss Yamada had sent him copies of textbooks she had written, marking passages where she had incorporated lessons from her internment experience. Other women had sent photographs of their families, their rebuilt lives, their grandchildren growing up in democratic Japan. Reflecting on his role in those events, Whitmore understood that Camp Florence had succeeded not through grand strategy but through simple consistency. The women had been treated with dignity every day for months, the hot water had flowed reliably, the food had been adequate, the privacy had been respected. That sustained decent treatment, maintained even when circumstances made it difficult or expensive, had demonstrated American values more effectively than propaganda ever could. The broader lesson extended beyond Japanese internees or World War II contexts. Throughout subsequent conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere, American military policies on prisoner treatment referenced the Camp Florence model. The principle that humane treatment advanced strategic interests while reflecting national values became embedded in military culture, though implementation varied across different contexts and commanders. By the 21st century, the Camp Florence story had become obscure, known primarily to military historians and specialists in prisoner of war policy. The facility itself had vanished entirely, the land repurposed for commercial development, yet the women who had lived there carried its legacy forward through their lives, their teaching, their testimony, and their influence on post-war Japanese society. The hot showers that had shocked them in March 1945 had represented an argument about humanity delivered through experience rather than rhetoric. That argument had proven persuasive precisely because it was genuine, sustained, and culturally informed. The women had arrived as enemies expecting cruelty. They departed as individuals whose understanding of Americans and democracy had been transformed by months of consistent decent treatment. Miss Yamada's final letter to Thomas Whitmore, written shortly before her death in 1992, summarized the lasting impact. You and the others at Camp Florence gave us something we had not expected and could not dismiss. You gave us evidence that challenged everything we had been taught about enemies and warfare. The hot water that shocked us on our first day represented a principle that transcended military necessity. It showed us that humanity survives even in conflict, that dignity can be maintained even in captivity, and that the true measure of a nation is how it treats those who cannot resist. Thank you for teaching us that lesson through actions rather than words. The story of Japanese women prisoners shocked by hot showers in American camps ultimately stands as testament to the power of sustained decent treatment in challenging propaganda and changing minds. It demonstrates that strategic objectives and humanitarian principles need not conflict, that respecting human dignity advances national interests while reflecting national values. The women who experienced that treatment became ambassadors of experience, spreading testimony about American humanity throughout post-war Japan. The investment in facilities like Camp Florence, questioned at the time as excessive, proved remarkably cost-effective when measured against strategic outcomes. The hot water that flowed through those shower stalls for less than a year contributed to changing attitudes that facilitated decades of peace and cooperation. The principle demonstrated through plumbing and boilers and reliable maintenance carried more persuasive power than arguments or declarations could have achieved. In the end, the significance of Camp Florence lay not in grand gestures but in daily consistency. The women were treated with respect every day, the hot water flowed reliably, the privacy was maintained, the cultural values were acknowledged. That sustained commitment to decent treatment, maintained even when difficult or expensive, demonstrated American principles through experience rather than propaganda. The women who lived at Camp Florence returned to Japan carrying evidence that challenged years of indoctrination. They shared their experiences with family, friends, students, and communities. Their testimony spread quietly but persistently, contributing to the transformation of a defeated enemy into a democratic ally. The hot showers that shocked them became symbols of a larger truth about humanity surviving even in warfare. Decades later, historians analyzing the occupation's success identified multiple factors, but the foundation of trust built through humane treatment during and after combat provided crucial groundwork. The women who experienced that treatment, like Miss Yamada, carried forward its lessons through their lives and work. They taught new generations about dignity, democracy, and the possibility of humanity transcending conflict. The empty shower building that stood for years after the war ended served as a concrete reminder that strategic success sometimes comes through unexpected means. Hot water had been provided not merely for physical comfort, but as demonstration of respect for human dignity. That demonstration, sustained consistently over months, had achieved strategic objectives while honoring humanitarian principles. The women who experienced it never forgot, and through their testimony, neither did their communities. Thomas Whitmore understood in his later years that Camp Florence represented something larger than one facility or 32 women. It represented a principle about how democracies should conduct themselves even in war, about how respecting human dignity advanced strategic interests while reflecting national values. The hot showers had been expensive and questioned at the time, yet they had contributed to outcomes that justified the investment many times over. The lasting legacy of Camp Florence lies not in physical structures long since demolished, but in changed attitudes that persisted across generations. The women who were shocked by hot showers in 1945 taught children who taught grandchildren about the principles they experienced through American treatment. Those principles influenced how post-war Japan developed its democracy, how it approached human rights, and how it taught new generations about dignity transcending conflict. The story demonstrates that revolutionary change sometimes comes not through dramatic confrontation but through sustained commitment to principle. The women expected cruelty and found kindness. They expected degradation and found dignity. They expected propaganda and found genuine commitment to values. That experience transformed understanding more effectively than any argument could have achieved. In a world that often questions whether humanitarian principles and strategic interests can align, Camp Florence offers evidence they can and must. The hot water that shocked Japanese women prisoners represented both strategic psychological warfare and genuine commitment to human dignity. It advanced American interests while honoring American values. It changed minds while reflecting principles. The women who experienced it became living testimony to the possibility of humanity surviving even in war. Their testimony spread across Japan, contributing to transformed attitudes that facilitated peaceful occupation and lasting alliance. The investment in their dignified treatment, questioned at the time as excessive, proved remarkably effective when measured against outcomes. The hot showers that symbolized respect for human dignity became arguments for democracy more persuasive than propaganda could ever achieve. The women of Compound C lived out their lives carrying forward the lessons learned in an Arizona prison camp. They taught students, raised families, built communities, and spread testimony about the possibility of dignity transcending conflict. Their experiences demonstrated that strategic success and humanitarian principle need not conflict, that respecting human dignity advances national interests while honoring national values. The hot water that shocked them on arrival continued flowing reliably through months of internment, providing not just physical comfort but psychological evidence that everything they had been taught about American cruelty was false. That evidence proved impossible to dismiss because it was experienced directly and sustained consistently. The women departed carrying understanding that challenged propaganda and transformed attitudes. Decades later, as historians assessed occupation success, they identified treatment of prisoners and internees as a crucial factor. The principle that winning peace required demonstrating values rather than just declaring them, that changing minds required consistent decent treatment rather than propaganda, became incorporated into doctrine for future conflicts. Camp Florence stood as evidence that principle worked. The story ultimately proves that the greatest strategic victories sometimes come through the simplest sustained actions. Hot water flowing reliably, privacy respected consistently, dignity maintained daily. These basic commitments to humane treatment achieved outcomes that elaborate propaganda could never have accomplished. The women who experienced that treatment became ambassadors of evidence, spreading testimony that transformed understanding across a nation. Their legacy endures in the principles they carried forward, the students they taught, the testimony they shared, and the changed attitudes that facilitated lasting peace. The hot showers that shocked them became symbols of something larger, proof that humanity survives even in conflict, that dignity transcends enmity, and that the true measure of a nation lies in how it treats even those who cannot resist. That lesson, demonstrated through months of consistent decent treatment in an Arizona prison camp, changed minds and influenced history in ways its architects could scarcely have imagined. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.